Good evening, my friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Wherever you sit, in the quiet of night, or the softness of dawn, let your mind rest here with me. Tonight, we travel deep into the heart of Africa, to a land of red earth and endless rivers, to the story of a man who rose from chains to become a symbol of resistance, a man whose faith carried him farther than any army, the legendary Samory Touré. Close your eyes. Listen to the hum of the river, the whisper of prayer in the wind. This is not just history. It is remembrance. Let us begin. I was born beside a river that remembers more than men do. The Milo flows through the red-brown hills of my homeland, its water glinting gold at sunrise and fading into indigo when the sky bows to night. Before I learned to read the Quran, I learned to read that water, to see how a current hesitates before a stone, how it divides and rejoins, how even surrender can look like grace. My people, the Mandinka, lived by the rhythm of that river. Prayers at dawn, markets at noon, drums at dusk. Everything in our world breathed with the same slow pulse. The hum of bees around calabash flowers, the crackle of firewood, the call to prayer unfurling through the mist like a thin blue ribbon of sound. My earliest memory is of my mother's hands, smelling faintly of smoke and shea. She would trace verses of the Quran in the dust before me, the letters rising like small brown hills under her fingertip. Every letter, she whispered, is a seed. Keep watering it with faith, and it will grow into protection. When she recited, her voice carried the weight of both mercy and command. Even the chickens paused to listen. She told me stories of the prophet and the desert wind that once guided caravans. She said every soul is born with a direction, its own Qibla, and that a man's life is a long prayer toward it. My father was a trader, forever walking between towns that smelled of salt and pepper. He was tall, quiet, and carried his dignity like a folded cloth over his shoulder. Sometimes he took me with him. I remember the markets, so loud they seemed to lift dust into music. There were pyramids of kola nuts shining like varnished amber, woven baskets of millet, and fabrics dyed the deep blue of night. Men bargained with laughter, women with silence, children darted like fish through the gaps between legs. Above all of it, the sun watched, huge and steady, as if to remind us that even prosperity is borrowed light. Those were the years before the shadow came, before rifles spoke in languages we did not yet understand, before names like France were whispered in the same tone as drought and locust. In those early days, the world felt entire and sufficient. A bowl of earth, a sky of mercy, a river that asked for nothing but respect. Each dawn, the village awoke to the muezzin's call. His voice rose from the small mud brick mosque, traveling through dew and smoke, finding every ear still half asleep. The men would wash their faces in the river. The women ground millet with rhythmic certainty. I remember the feel of cool clay under my feet, the smell of rain on iron soil, the taste of palm wine diluted with river water, thin, sweet, and honest. We believed the world was balanced because we kept it so, by prayer, by labor, by the sharing of bread and forgiveness. In the evenings, elders gathered beneath the baobab tree whose trunk was so broad that 10 men could not encircle it. They told stories older than memory. Some were tales of kings and jinn, others of the first call to prayer ever heard on our soil. I sat with my chin on my knees, tracing shapes in the dust, feeling the night settle like a shawl. When they spoke of heroes who had defended the innocent, I felt something awaken, a pulse in my chest that matched the steady breathing of the earth itself. I did not yet know its name, but later I would call it duty. The seasons marked me as surely as any teacher. During Harmattan, the wind blew from the Sahara carrying whispers of faraway wars. It left a fine red powder on every surface, even our food. My mother would laugh and say, "The desert is writing letters to the forest." In the rainy months, thunder rolled like a drum calling warriors to assembly, and lightning stitched the clouds together with silver thread. At night, frogs chanted by the flooded fields, and I fell asleep thinking they were reciting praises in a language too old for men to translate. I was 10 when my father placed a musket in my hands for the first time. He said, "A man must know both the pen and the weapon, but he must never confuse their purposes." The gun was heavy, smelling of iron and oil. The wooden stock was warm from other hands. I did not fire it that day. I only watched the reflection of the river on its barrel and thought how easily light bends on cold metal. Our teacher at the madrasa, old Alpha Sori, believed knowledge was an armor sharper than any blade. He made us memorize not only the Quran, but also histories of empires that had risen and fallen like tides. Ghana, Mali, Songhai. "Remember them," he said, "so you will not think the white man wrote the first chapter of this land." When I mispronounced a verse, he tapped my knuckles lightly and smiled. "Pain," he told us, "is God reminding you to pay attention." Sometimes at night, I would walk to the riverbank alone. The moon turned the water to hammered silver, and the crickets argued softly among the reeds. I would scoop a handful of river sand and let it run through my fingers, whispering the 99 names of God. I believed each grain that slipped away carried one prayer to the unseen. In those quiet hours, I began to sense that life was not just what we lived, but what we remembered with reverence. The land itself was a scripture. Every termite mound a comma, every thunderclap a verse. Then came the season when the peace cracked. Riders appeared on the horizon, thin silhouettes against the copper sky. They were not of our village. Their horses carried flags that bore no familiar sign. Rumors traveled faster than they did, of raids, of captives, of towns burned for ivory and obedience. My father grew restless. He spoke with the elders in low voices that ended in sighs. My mother prayed longer at dawn, her palms trembling slightly as she lifted them. The market, once bright with noise, began to sound like a question. One afternoon, while the air hung heavy with dust and expectation, I saw smoke rising beyond the hills. It looked harmless at first, like the breath of a cooking fire. But then the wind changed, and we smelled what fire becomes when it feeds on roofs. The drums sounded the alarm. My father told me to stay with my mother, but fear makes poor listeners of children. I followed him, barefoot, my heart drumming faster than the talking drums. What I saw that day would divide my life in two: the time before and everything after. I saw the riders sweeping through millet fields, their rifles flashing like fragments of sun. I saw neighbors fall and not rise again. I saw my father lift his musket and shout the name of God, his voice snatched by the wind. I saw my mother pulled onto a horse, her blue scarf flying from her shoulders like a frightened bird. When the dust settled, silence crawled over the land. The river kept flowing, indifferent, carrying pieces of straw and memory downstream. I remember kneeling on the red earth, pressing my palms into it, as if to stop the world from moving. The ground was warm. It pulsed faintly, as if consoling me. I whispered every verse I knew, every word of protection I had ever learned, but the air returned them unanswered. That night, our village was only embers. The moon rose pale and trembling above the ruins. I found my father wounded, but alive. He said nothing. Words had become luxuries we could not afford. He bound his leg with his own turban and told me we would search for her when the morning came. Sleep, he said. Though we both knew sleep had fled these lands, I lay beside him, staring at the stars. Each one looked like an eye that refused to close. I thought of my mother's voice saying, "Every letter is a seed." Perhaps, I reasoned, every sorrow is a seed too. Maybe one day it grows into something fierce enough to shade others from the sun. Before dawn, we rose and began walking. The horizon was bruised purple, the world holding its breath between night and revelation. I did not know it then, but that road, the ochre dust beneath my feet, the silence of burned huts, the taste of smoke on my tongue, was the first step on a journey that would consume my entire life. I remember the river before I remember my own face. It ran brown and luminous through the valley of Milo, twisting like a verse that God himself had whispered into the clay. Before words, before swords, before kingdoms, there was that sound, water murmuring to stone, reeds bowing in prayer to the wind. My mother used to say that the river taught patience to the earth because it never hurried, yet it carved mountains. Perhaps she was right, for I have lived my life by that same patience, slow, unbroken, carrying silt and story alike toward an unseen sea. I was born when the fields were fat with millet, when thunder rolled like a drum announcing a birth to heaven. The first hands that lifted me smelled of shea butter and smoke from cooking fires. They pressed a date against my tongue so that my words would be sweet, and drew a line of coal along my brow so that no evil eye might rest upon me. In our compound, the morning always began with the adhan, a call so pure that even birds paused on the tamarind branches to listen. I would watch my father spread his mat, the ochre dust rising around him like incense, his forehead lowering to the ground, his breath steady, calm, endless. It was in that rhythm that I first learned the shape of devotion. Our home stood near the river bend, half hidden by tall grasses and banana trees. When the wind came from the east, the leaves shimmered like shields, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. I used to sit by the water's edge, tracing circles in the mud, imagining they were worlds I might one day walk. Fish darted through the shallows, their silver bellies flashing like promises. I would listen to the talk of grown men, of caravans from the north, of the price of salt, of rumors that certain kings were buying men as if they were cattle. At that age, I didn't yet know what it meant to be owned. But I felt a chill every time the elders spoke in lowered tones. Freedom, though unnamed, already had a scent, that of river air after rain, of smoke from our fires, of my mother's skin when she bent to kiss me goodnight. My earliest teacher was an old man with eyes clouded like river water before a storm. He carried a small wooden tablet and a stick dipped in ink made from soot and gum. We would sit beneath a mango tree, the light shifting like liquid gold through the leaves, and he would make me copy the letters of the Quran. The curves and points were like little boats. Some days they floated, some days they sank. When I got a verse right, he smiled. And that smile was worth more to me than any coin. He taught me that the world itself was a book written in two scripts, one of words, the other of deeds, and that to read it fully, a man must master both. My mother's name was Fatoumata. She was gentle but not fragile. Her strength was the kind that never needed to raise its voice. When I fell asleep at her side, I could hear her whispering verses beneath her breath, her fingers moving through prayer beads smooth as river stones. She believed that every hardship was a test wrapped in mercy, and that the only true failure was forgetfulness of God. In the evenings, she would tell me stories of the prophet's patience, of Bilal's steadfast heart, of warriors who fought only when justice demanded. Her words filled the night like constellations. I think she was the first to make me understand that faith was not only for the mosque, it was for the marketplace, the field, the blade, the heart. My father, however, lived in motion. He was a trader who crossed long distances, carrying cola nuts, cloth, salt, and sometimes messages between chiefs. When he returned from his journeys, dust lay thick on his robe, and stories clung to him like burrs. He would tell of great cities, of Timbuktu, where scholars debated beneath lamplit domes, of Kong, where gold was so common that merchants measured it by weight of cloth, of the distant coast where white men built wooden houses that floated on water. As a child, I imagined those white men as jinn, half spirit, half storm. My father said they traded in everything: mirrors, guns, beads, and men. When he said the last word, he spat into the dirt. That gesture stayed with me more deeply than any sermon. One season, when I was about 8, my father took me on one of his journeys. We traveled with a caravan of 30 donkeys and 10 men, following paths the color of rust through forests where parrots screamed like laughter. At night, we made camp near villages that glowed with cooking fires. I learned how to read the sky for direction, how to tie a bundle so it would not rub a sore on the animal's back, how to sleep lightly, like a leaf that wakes at the first tremor of wind. In one marketplace, I saw my first chain, a loop of iron links thick as a thumb. It hung from a stall where a man sold tools. When I touched it, it was cool, heavy, and somehow sad. My father pulled me away and said, "Do not touch what remembers sorrow." I didn't understand, but the phrase rooted itself in me. Years later, when I heard men's wrists clink in bondage, I finally knew what that chain remembered. Back home, seasons folded into each other like the pages of a worn book. Rains came and went, floods and harvests, weddings and funerals. I grew taller. My hands grew calloused, my mind restless. Sometimes I would watch the older boys train with spears, their feet sure, their eyes bright. I wanted to join them, but my mother insisted I finish my Quran first. "Strength without wisdom," she said, "is like fire in a dry field. It destroys even the good grain." So I stayed with my teacher, learning not only verses but the art of silence, of listening. He told me, "One day, Samory, you will speak with the authority of thunder. But remember, thunder is only respected because it listens first to the clouds." When the dry season stretched too long and the wells tasted of iron, I would sit under the baobab tree and imagine the world beyond our hills. Sometimes traders brought news of wars to the north. Kingdoms devouring kingdoms, captives sold in markets that smelled of sweat and salt. My friends would whisper about glory, about the thrill of battle, about the chance to earn a name. But in my dreams, I saw no glory, only smoke and mothers wailing. Even then, I feared that the sound of a drum could drown the sound of a prayer. I remember a night when lightning walked the sky like a restless god. I could not sleep, so I crept outside. The river glowed pale under the storm, every drop a mirror. I thought of how the old men said each life was a river too, and that some rivers ran long, others ended early, but all sought the sea of their creator. I asked aloud, "What will my river carry?" The answer came only as thunder, but somehow I heard a whisper inside it. Carry what you must, but never forget your source. The years that followed tested that whisper. One afternoon, when the air was still and thick, the ground itself seemed to hum. Dogs barked, goats scattered. From the western ridge, a plume of dust rose, thin at first, then swelling, moving like a beast with many legs. The raiders came suddenly, their cries sharp, their horses painted with white mud. My father was away. My mother shouted for me to run. I remember the glint of metal, the smell of fear, like wet iron and sweat. Our compound burned, its thatch collapsing in a sigh of embers. Hands seized me, rough as bark. I saw my mother struck, falling, her blue headscarf unfurling in the smoke. Even now, I can see it, blue against the ochre dust, fluttering like the last wing of peace. That was the day the river inside me changed course. It no longer murmured, it roared. And though I did not yet know it, that roar would one day echo across empires. They bound our wrists with rope that smelled of goat hide and rain. The fibers bit through the skin until my pulse throbbed inside each knot. Around me, the air quivered with dust and weeping. The smoke of our village still clung to our clothes, a ghost that refused to leave. The riders shouted in a tongue of command and cruelty. I heard them laugh, low, careless laughs that made even the horses uneasy. They herded us together, men, women, children, like frightened goats under a burning sky. Every step we took kicked up the same dust that had once fed our millet. Now it choked us. We walked for days. The sun hung above us like judgment. When it fell, the night offered no mercy. Some fell by the roadside, and the riders did not stop to bury them. Their bodies lay in the moonlight, pale shapes on the ochre ground. And I wondered if the angels could find them without a prayer to guide their souls. I was still only a boy, but the world had already peeled away its kindness. Each dawn, when the cock crowed in some unseen village, I whispered a verse from the Quran and told myself that every step was counted by God, that perhaps even suffering had its measure and its reward. After a week, we reached a camp ringed with thorn fences. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, ash, and sorrow. Here the captives were sorted. Mothers clung to children, men shouted the names of wives, elders stared at the earth so they would not break in front of their sons. When they tore my mother from me, I did not cry. Tears are for when hope still has a door. Mine had already closed. I remember her hands reaching toward me. Henna faded, bracelets clinking, a music of loss I can still hear. Then the crowd swallowed her, and the world became smaller. The man who claimed me was called Bura. He was a minor king, fierce in war and proud of his cruelty. His fortress stood on a hill of red clay, its walls plastered smooth as bone. To reach it, we climbed paths that twisted through thorn bushes, that drew blood with every branch. Inside, drums beat day and night, sometimes for victory, sometimes for fear. There I learned the difference between a prison and a kingdom. In both, men obey without love. They gave me to the soldiers who guarded the gates. At first, I carried water, scrubbed pots, cleaned muskets heavy as my own body. I learned to keep my head bowed, my voice small, my movements invisible. But captivity teaches more than obedience. It sharpens the edges of the mind. Each task became a lesson. How much water a man drinks after battle, how long it takes to reload a rifle, how fatigue loosens vigilance. At night, I listened to their boasts by the fire, memorizing the rhythm of command, the arguments of strategy disguised as drunken talk. Every humiliation I endured, I stored like coin. One day I promised myself I would spend it dearly. In those first months, I was treated as less than the horses I tended. Yet the horses themselves became my companions. They snorted at my scent, then grew used to it. Their eyes, large and amber, reflected a mercy that men had forgotten. When I brushed their manes, I thought of the verses that spoke of patience. I would whisper prayers into their ears so that at least one creature in that place heard kindness spoken each day. Once a week, a traveling imam visited the fortress. He was thin as a reed and carried a leather-bound Quran that looked older than he was. He would sit in the courtyard and recite aloud, his voice trembling but clear. The soldiers mocked him, but they let him speak because superstition told them that denying the word brought bad luck. I would creep close, hiding behind the water jars, listening. His recitations were like drops of rain on parched soil. Each word sank deep, reviving what captivity had tried to dry. When he finished, he looked at me, not as a master looks at a servant, but as a teacher looks at a student he already recognizes. He never spoke my name, yet each time he returned, he left a folded scrap of parchment near the water trough. On it were verses written in careful hand. I hid them under my sleeping mat. When the nights were long, I traced the letters with my finger, the way my mother had traced them in dust. 2 years passed. Seasons changed, each carrying its own cruelty. The rains turned the camp into a pit of mud. The dry winds filled every bowl with dust. Men died quietly, and no one counted them. The women were sent away. To whom? No one said. I stopped asking. Silence became my shield, memory my only companion. But inside that silence, something grew. A resolve as hard as the iron rings that bound us. One day Bourra summoned all young captives to the field. He wanted to train new soldiers, he said. The irony tasted bitter. Those once conquered would now learn to conquer others. But I stepped forward. I had decided that survival would be my rebellion. If they taught me to fight, I would learn. If they armed me, I would remember. If they trusted me, I would wait. Training was merciless. We rose before dawn, running barefoot over gravel until our feet bled. We learned to march without sound, to load and fire muskets in rhythm with drum beats, to wield spears until our arms shook. Many fell. Few were spared. But I endured. Pain became routine, hunger a teacher, exhaustion a prayer that never needed words. When my body refused, my faith replaced it. Each night I cleaned my weapon by moonlight. whispering Bismillah before every movement. In that act, even violence became a form of remembrance. The older warriors noticed. Some mocked me as the boy who prays too much. Others began to respect the steadiness with which I worked, the precision of my aim. One evening, during a raid, Bora himself rode beside me. We had attacked a rival village. The battle was smoke and shouting. I saw a man my father's age running toward me, unarmed. For an instant, time slowed. The dust, the noise, the chaos dissolved. He looked at me not as an enemy, but as a mirror. I lowered my rifle. Bora saw and struck me across the mouth with his whip. Blood filled my tongue. The taste of iron reminded me of every chain I had touched. I raised my rifle again, but not against the old man. I fired into the air, the sound echoing across the hills like a refusal carved into sky. After that, Bora kept me close. Perhaps he mistook my restraint for loyalty. He sent me on errands to nearby outposts, sometimes alone. Each journey became a map in my mind. The bends of the river, the places where guards grew lazy, the paths where hoofprints vanished in reeds. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was a direction. During the 3rd year of captivity, rumors reached us of a great movement of faith spreading through the lands. The call of jihad against the traders who sold their own kind. I listened to the stories with my heart pounding. If men elsewhere could rise, why not here? I began to pray for a sign, any sign, that the time had come. It arrived as quietly as dawn. One morning, the camp awoke to find the stables ablaze. In the confusion, men ran shouting, buckets clanging, orders lost. I slipped through the smoke, clutching only a small knife and the scrap of parchment from the imam. The air was thick and sweet with burning hay. A guard lunged at me. I struck his hand, felt bone give way, and kept running. Past the gates, down the slope, through the thorn fields that had once torn my flesh. I ran until blood filled my sandals and the sun bled out behind the hills. Freedom has a sound. It is breath ragged but unowned. For days I moved through forests, guided by stars and memory. I ate wild fruit, drank from puddles that reflected the moon. The world was vast again, merciful again. But even as the wounds on my feet closed, the one inside me did not. I thought of my mother. Was she alive? Was she free? Each question became a prayer, and each prayer a promise. I would find her, or I would become the kind of man who could free others in her name. When at last I stumbled upon a village of strangers, my body was thin as a reed, my hair matted with dust. The imam of that village found me collapsed near the mosque steps. He washed my face, gave me water, and asked my name. When I told him, he nodded slowly, as if the name already belonged to history. "You have been tested," he said. "Now you must choose what the test has made of you." I looked toward the east, where the river of my childhood lay unseen beyond hills and memory. And I answered, "It has made me a man who will never live free, while another lives chained." When I left the fortress behind me, the world opened like a wound. The sky was wide and merciless, the color of bleached bone. Every shadow looked like a memory trying to follow me. For days I walked without direction, guided only by the pulse of the earth and the ache in my chest. Freedom was supposed to taste sweet, but at first it tasted like dust. I followed riverbeds when I could, because rivers remember where people go. They twist toward villages, toward crops and voices and smoke. I drank where cattle drank, slept where no footprints lingered. The moon became my only companion. She never asked questions, only watched as I dragged myself from one horizon to the next. Some nights I dreamed of my mother, her hands pressing dough, her voice reciting verses that smelled of cardamom and dawn. I woke with her name already dissolving in my mouth. I passed through lands I had never seen, forests thick with vines, where monkeys screamed warnings from the treetops, plains where the wind carried the smell of ash and faraway fires. Once I came upon a village still smoldering from a raid. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt grain and fear. Bodies lay twisted among broken pots, and in the middle of the square, a child's shoe rested upright, untouched by flame. I turned away, my stomach hollow. Wherever I went, the same story repeated. Chains, raids, and silence. It was as though the earth itself had been enslaved, its breath caught in its throat. In one town, a merchant told me of a woman taken years ago from the Milo Valley, sold and then freed, living now among refugees farther south. He spoke her name softly. Fatoumata, my mother's name. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. I pressed him for details, but he only shrugged. In those days, truth traveled no faster than rumor, and both changed shape along the way. Still, I felt the old river stir within me, whispering, "Follow." The journey took months. I worked for food, carried water, mended fences, anything to keep moving. Each village I entered, I asked the same question. Some had heard of her. Others only shook their heads, offering sympathy in the form of millet and prayer. I learned to read disappointment the way others read maps. But the trail, however faint, remained. One evening, as the sun melted into copper behind the hills, I came upon a settlement by the river. Women were washing clothes, their laughter soft and tired. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the smell of ground nuts and wood ash. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure why my heart was hammering so fiercely. Then I saw her. She was bent over a basin, her hair silvered by years, her wrists thin as branches. But her hands, those hands, moved with the same grace I remembered. The world tilted. My legs refused to move. I whispered her name once, twice, as if afraid it would break if I spoke it too loud. She turned, and in that instant, time folded like cloth. Her eyes found me, disbelieving. She froze, the cloth slipping from her fingers. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, the kind that holds the entire sky inside it. Then she ran. We met halfway, stumbling, colliding, clutching each other as if to keep from falling through the years. I felt her tears on my neck, hot and salt and real. She touched my face, tracing the lines time had written there. "My son," she said, the words trembling like a prayer set free, and all I could answer was, "Mother." I came back. We sat together by the river until the sun sank. The water caught the last light and turned it gold. She told me of her years in bondage, how she had been sold and traded, how a pious family had finally bought her freedom. She had survived by teaching the Quran to children, verses she once taught me by drawing them in dust. Her faith had been her armor, her memory of me, her fire. "I knew you would live," she said quietly. I felt it in my bones every dawn. That night, we prayed side by side. The stars were countless, like the beads of her worn tasbih. When we finished, I sat in silence while she whispered another prayer. This time not to find me, but to thank the one who had brought me home. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted. Freedom, I realized, was not the absence of chains. It was the presence of purpose. Later, when she slept, I walked down to the river. The moon floated on the surface like a coin offered to heaven. I looked at my reflection. A man, no longer boy. Scarred, but unbroken. I spoke aloud, though no one could hear me but God. I swear, I said, by this river that raised me, by the mother who prayed for me, and by the verses that kept me alive. No man of my people shall live in chains while I draw breath. I will fight for the freedom of our land, for justice written not by conquerors, but by faith, for the dignity that you placed in every soul. And if I must die for it, then let my blood mix with this river, so that it may remember. The water moved, a soft ripple touching my feet, as if in answer. The next morning, I told my mother of my vow. She listened without fear. You were born for this, she said. But remember, power is a guest. Treat it with humility, or it will turn against you. Her words settled into me like seeds in fertile ground. From that day, I began to gather others. Men who had lost everything but hope. Runaway slaves, traders ruined by war, farmers tired of seeing their harvest stolen. We trained by the riverbank, not in hatred, but in discipline. Our weapons were few, our faith abundant. We called ourselves the sons of the river. For like it, we would bend, but never break. Each dawn we prayed before practice, and each dusk we swore to harm no innocent, to steal no bread, to take only what was necessary for survival and defense. My mother watched us from the hill, her veil fluttering in the wind like a banner. At sunset, she would bring water to the men and bless them with a verse. She said the day would come when our prayers would rise together over the land, and even the trees would remember our names. That was the beginning, not of empire, not yet, but of conviction. In the quiet of those nights, with crickets chanting and fireflies flickering like sparks of divine light, we forged something stronger than swords. Belief. Belief that a handful of free men could hold back an empire of iron. Belief that God does not abandon those who refuse to abandon each other. And belief, above all, that freedom, once awakened, never sleeps again. The vow did not end when I spoke it. It began to live inside me, like fire hidden in wood. Every dawn that followed, I woke to the sound of the river and the memory of my mother's quiet strength. Her faith had survived the captivity. Mine would now survive freedom. From that seed, the first shoots of my purpose began to break through the earth. I started small. Freedom, like a tree, grows from the humblest root. A few men came first, hunters, traders, wanderers with calloused hands and stories written in scars. They had lost their homes to raids, their kin to chains. They came with eyes that carried the same hollow hunger I had once known. I offered them no gold, no promise of easy victory. Only prayer, discipline, and a vision of a land where no man was owned by another. They listened, and they stayed. We built our first camp beneath a great baobab tree, whose branches reached the sky like arms raised in supplication. The ground there was rich and red. When it rained, it bled. We cleared the thorns, dug a fire pit, and erected a small shelter for prayer. Our days were simple. Work, train, pray, rest. Each man learned to march in silence, to move with the rhythm of the earth. We had no uniforms, only patched robes and faith worn like armor. The rifle I had stolen in my escape became our model. Piece by piece, we learned to mend old weapons, to shape gunpowder from what traders smuggled through secret paths, to sharpen blades until they gleamed like new moons. At night, when the forest breathed its slow music, I would sit before the fire and speak to them, not as a king, but as a brother. I told them that our strength would not come from numbers, but from the purity of our intention. We would not plunder. We would not enslave. Our war would be one of deliverance, not dominion. Some called it madness. I called it faith applied to steel. Soon the news spread. Men came from villages far beyond the Milo Valley. They arrived barefoot, carrying only hope and the memory of humiliation. Some brought muskets inherited from fathers. Others came with only their bare hands and prayers. Each was welcomed, washed in the river, and given a new name, Soldier of the Free. Before their first battle, I made them promise, never raise your hand against the innocent. Never steal what hunger does not force. And never forget that every victory belongs first to God. Our first skirmishes were against raiders, the same kind who had once taken my mother. We attacked them by moonlight, moving like shadows among the trees. The crack of our rifles split the silence. The enemy fled, startled by the ferocity of men who fought not for loot, but for justice. When the smoke cleared, we freed their captives. Thin, trembling figures whose eyes struggled to believe deliverance had come. We cut their chains with borrowed blades and whispered verses over them. Each liberation was a prayer answered. As months turned into years, the ranks swelled. Our discipline, our fairness, our devotion drew the weary and the brave alike. Villages began to offer food willingly. Mothers sent blessings with their sons. We built schools for Quranic learning, taught the young to read not only the book, but the world around them. I appointed judges, men of integrity who weighed disputes by the law of God, not the temptation of gold. For every soldier, I required a scholar. For every rifle, a page of scripture. I wanted an army with a soul. We traveled far, through forests where the air was sweet with mango, across plains that shimmered under a white sun. Wherever we went, the people began to whisper a name, Samory. At first it was only curiosity, then respect, then something heavier, hope. And hope, when shared, becomes destiny. One morning, as the mist lifted from the fields, the elders of several clans came to our camp. They bowed low and said, "We see in you the return of our lost dignity. Lead us, not as a conqueror, but as the guardian of our faith and land." Their words fell on me like the weight of armor. I knew then that leadership is not a crown one takes. It is a burden one accepts. I bowed in return and answered, "If I must lead, then I will lead in prayer first." That evening, under the baobab's wide shade, they anointed me Fama, ruler. But when they poured the oil of blessing over my brow, I felt no triumph, only trembling. My mother watched from the crowd, her face proud yet grave. When all the cheers had faded, she came to me and said, "Remember, my son, a throne made of faith will burn if arrogance sits upon it." I promised her it never would. With the title came responsibility and vision. We built roads between allied villages, secured markets, and established watchtowers to guard the borders. Trade flourished. People began to travel safely again. Our army trained not in cruelty, but in precision. Lines straight, commands clear, rifles clean, prayers punctual. Every morning before dawn, the entire camp bowed toward the east, the rising sun gilding the edges of our mats. When we rose, the land seemed lighter, as if the soil itself approved. I began to send emissaries to neighboring chiefs. Some welcomed us as brothers, others feared our growing strength. To them I sent gifts, salt, cloth, and peace treaties inscribed with my own hand. But to those who persisted in selling their people to foreign traders, I sent only warnings. Stop, or the sons of the river will come. A few laughed. They do not laugh in history. As the seasons turned, what began as a circle of believers became a nation. Our capital rose near Bisandugu, among rolling hills and red earth that glowed like embers at sunset. We built a great mosque there, its walls of clay and timber breathing coolness even in the hottest noon. When its minaret first caught the morning light, I felt as though the entire sky had joined our prayer. From that place, the Wassoulou Empire was born, not in conquest, but in covenant. We were bound not by blood alone, but by purpose, to preserve dignity, to defend the weak, to serve the divine justice that is the measure of all rule. I did not call myself emperor. The people did. And every time they did, I reminded them, there is no empire without righteousness, no sovereignty without submission to God. In the evenings, I often walked among the soldiers, speaking softly so as not to disturb their rest. They would sit polishing weapons by lantern light, laughter mingling with recitations of verse. Sometimes they asked, "Fama, will this peace last?" And I would answer, "Peace is a garden. We must keep planting it, even when war rains down." The stars above Bisandugu were the same ones that had watched over my youth. Under their light, I thought often of the path from captivity to command. The river that once carried my tears now carried caravans of trade. The boy who once whispered prayers into darkness now led thousands in prayer at dawn. But in my heart, I knew the test was not over. Beyond our borders, other powers gathered, the pale men with maps and hunger in their eyes. They had heard of samurai too, and they were coming. At first, they came with smiles. The French. They carried papers and promises, mirrors and medals, wine and words that glittered like coins. They spoke of friendship, of trade, of a shared destiny. But I had learned long ago that a snake's skin shines most beautifully just before it strikes. The first envoys arrived in the dry season. Their horses were lean, their faces hidden beneath white helmets that reflected the sun too perfectly. I received them beneath the baobab, where I had once sworn my vow. They bowed stiffly, unused to the gesture, and one of them, his voice soft but full of command, said, "We come on behalf of France, the great protector of civilization. We offer peace, commerce, and progress. I asked him what that word meant. He smiled and said, "Roads, schools, churches." "Law," I answered. "We already have roads made by rivers, schools built by faith, laws written by God. What more do we need?" His smile faded just slightly. Still, we spoke with courtesy. Hospitality is sacred, even when danger wears a polite face. For 3 days, they stayed in Bisandugu. I fed them millet bread and honey, and I let them watch the prayers at dawn. They seemed puzzled by the sight of so many men bowing in silence. One whispered to another, "They have discipline." Yes, I thought. Discipline and purpose. When they left, they gave me a medal with a symbol of their empire etched into its face. I kept it in my tent as a reminder. Even gold can rust under the wrong sky. Not long after, they returned. But this time, not with gifts. They came with guns. At first, small detachments moved through the borderlands, building forts by the river, cutting paths through the bush. They said it was to protect their traders. But soon, their traders became soldiers. Their protection became occupation. Villages that refused to bow found their crops burned, their wells filled with ash. The wind carried stories of destruction, and each one felt like a spark landing on dry grass. I called a council. The chiefs gathered beneath the straight roof of the meeting hall, their turbans white, their faces grave. Some urged diplomacy, others spoke of jihad. I listened to them all. Then I said, "We will talk first, but we will talk with our eyes open and our weapons clean. For peace without vigilance is only a lullaby before conquest." I sent envoys to the nearest French command. They returned with letters written in a language few of us could read, and gifts meant to buy our silence. Alongside the gifts came an offer, a treaty of friendship. It was written on thick paper, the ink bright blue. I read it line by line through a translator, and I saw the truth hidden between the words. Friendship meant obedience, trade meant tribute, peace meant surrender. I told the envoy, "When you write the word brotherhood, but your ink smells of blood, I cannot sign." He bowed stiffly, then left. 2 moons later, French patrols crossed the river. Our first encounter was near the border village of Koundian. The air was heavy with heat and anticipation. We watched their columns advance, rows of blue coats, rifles glinting, flags fluttering like arrogant birds. They marched with drums and bugles, confident that no one could challenge their thunder. But thunder without rain is only noise. We struck at dawn. From the high grass we fired, moved, vanished, fired again. The sound of battle rolled through the valley like a storm breaking its chains. When the smoke cleared, their line was broken. We collected their weapons, buried our dead, and prayed. Victory is never pure joy. Every life taken stains the soil, even when it's for freedom. That night, I sat alone by the river and asked God to keep arrogance from my heart. War has a hunger that grows with every meal. If you do not chain it, it will one day devour the hand that feeds it. Over the next years, we fought and negotiated again. The French sent officers who spoke our language, offered gifts of salt and silver, promised boundaries that shifted like mirages. Each treaty was a pause in a song that never ended. I signed some because I needed time to train, to arm, to strengthen the unity of our people. A man who fights for eternity must learn patience. But I never signed away our right to stand as free men. My soldiers learned new tactics. We studied the weapons we captured, French rifles that fired faster, cleaner. I ordered our blacksmiths to build workshops where iron met faith. Day and night they hammered, sparks flying like golden rain. In the rhythm of their hammers, I heard a prayer. We are still here. We began to make our own cartridges, our own gunpowder, our own laws of war. Each bullet, each blade, was a verse written in defiance. As our forces grew, so did our responsibilities. We needed supply lines, food stores, discipline. I appointed commanders who knew that victory depended as much on mercy as on might. To the men I said, "Do not fight to destroy. Fight to protect. The moment you fight for revenge, you become your enemy." They listened, and they obeyed. Yet I could feel the shadow thickening. The French were not alone. They had allies. African kings seduced by their gold. Merchants who traded liberty for cloth. Soldiers who had forgotten which ancestors' blood flowed in their veins. sometimes betrayal hurt more than bullets. One evening, my mother came to me in the mosque courtyard. She was older now, her steps slower, but her gaze still clear as dawn. "Do not let hatred blind you," she said. "The white man's greed is his curse. Do not make it yours." I bowed my head. "I will not, Mother. But I will not kneel either." She smiled sadly. "Then you are truly your father's son." In 1882, the French sent a major column deeper into our lands. Their leader demanded my submission, my disarmament, and the right to station troops near our capital. I sent him a simple reply. If God had wished us to be slaves, he would not have given us tongues to speak his name. The messenger never returned. The battles that followed were fierce. At Kita, at Bamako, at Nyagasola, the earth drank deeply of courage and blood. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the chant of warriors reciting Allahu Akbar, the acrid scent of powder mixing with the sweetness of crushed grass. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost ground, but we never surrendered our will. Even when forced to retreat, we carried our dignity with us, like a flag that cannot be torn. After one long campaign, I stood upon a hill overlooking the smoking fields. The sun was sinking, its light red as remembrance. I felt neither triumph nor despair, only endurance. Empires rise, empires fall, but faith endures, and freedom, once tasted, becomes an inheritance no conqueror can confiscate. That night I wrote in my journal, "The French have rifles. We have time. Time belongs to God, and therefore, so do we. War is a long road that teaches a man how heavy victory can be. At first, it feels like a flame. Bright, righteous, pure. But the longer it burns, the more it consumes. By the time the French shadow fell fully upon our lands, I had already seen enough blood to know that even justice leaves ashes. The first years of open war were victories wrapped in wounds. We would strike, disappear, and strike again. Our rifles sang beneath the moonlight. Our horses thundered across the savannah. Our cries mingled with verses of the Quran that turned fear into rhythm. Each battle began with prayer and ended with silence. We buried our dead wrapped in the same earth they had defended, and I would stand over their graves whispering, "You did not die for me. You died for tomorrow." But tomorrow was growing thin. The French columns multiplied. Their forts crept across the map like sores spreading under fever. They brought new weapons, artillery that split the air like thunder, rifles that fired smokeless fire. Our enemies fought not only with men, but with factories, ships, and time itself. Every bullet they spent was replaced by 1,000 more. Every bullet we spent was a sacrifice counted in prayer. I began to move the heart of my empire. When one capital fell, another rose. From Bisandugu to Kankan, from Kankan to Kong, we carried not just weapons, but the spirit of a nation refusing to die. The women of the villages sang as we passed, their voices trembling but proud. They beat drums not for celebration, but for endurance. They sent us water, grain, and blessings whispered over newborns who might never see peace. Faith was our currency, and it never lost value. Still, I will not lie. There were nights when even faith trembled. I remember one evening, after a long retreat through the forest. Rain fell so heavy that it drowned the fire before it could breathe. My men huddled under leaves, their eyes hollow from hunger. I looked at them and saw not soldiers, but sons, each face a page in the book of my responsibility. I knelt in the mud, lifted my hands, and whispered, "Lord, you command both victory and defeat. If it is your will that we suffer, let us suffer without cruelty. If it is your will that we triumph, let us triumph without arrogance. When I rose, the rain had eased, and for a brief moment the moon broke through the clouds. In its light, I saw something shining in the mud. An old bullet casing, empty but unbroken. I kept it in my pouch as a reminder. We too may be spent, but we will not shatter. Famine came next, the silent enemy. Fields burned by war lay barren, trade routes cut by gunfire. The people began to eat whatever the forest offered. Roots, bark, leaves boiled in sorrow. I shared their hunger. I refused extra rations even when my guards begged me. A leader who eats more than his people is already conquered. At night, I walked among the tents, listening to the sound of children coughing in their sleep. Each cough was a question. How long must this last? I had no answer but hope. Yet even in hunger, the heart of the empire kept beating. Our blacksmiths still forged weapons in secret caves, the sound of their hammers echoing like distant thunder. Our scholars still gathered by candlelight to read and debate, their words weaving strength from the threads of faith. And my soldiers still stood guard, their silhouettes framed by the orange glow of campfires, eyes fixed on a horizon they refused to surrender. One dawn, as mist curled over the grass, I gathered them all. The sun had not yet risen, but its promise hung in the pale blue of the east. I told them, brothers, we fight not because we hate, but because we remember. Our fathers' chains, our mothers' tears, our children's right to sleep unafraid, these are our banners. And if the day comes when I fall, do not weep for me. Bury me standing, so I may keep facing the enemy. They answered not with words, but with the echo of hands beating on chests. That sound carried farther than any trumpet. As the war stretched into years, betrayal found its way into our ranks. Some chiefs who had once sworn loyalty now courted the French, seduced by the promise of safety and silver. They said Samurai's war was endless, that God had turned his face. But I knew faith is not a bargain. It is a bridge built in the dark, crossed by those who trust the unseen shore. So I crossed it, even when the planks groaned beneath me. We moved again, south, toward the dense forests of Côte d'Ivoire. There the trees grew tall enough to touch the sky, their roots thick as serpents, their shade deep as the ocean. We built new strongholds among them, fortresses hidden beneath the canopy where even sunlight needed permission to enter. Our scouts learned to read the forest like scripture, where the leaves trembled, where the birds fell silent, where enemy boots pressed the moss. We became ghosts, appearing, vanishing, striking where least expected. The French called it sorcery. We called it survival. But even ghosts grow weary. Our numbers thinned, our ammunition dwindled, and the songs of victory became whispers of remembrance. Still, we endured. I often thought of my mother during those years. She had grown frail, her once steady hands trembling when she poured water for the evening prayer. Yet her spirit was untouched by defeat. One night she said to me, "My son, even fire grows tired of burning. Let your heart be like coal, quiet, enduring, still warm beneath the ash." I did not know then how soon I would need those words. The French pressed harder, their columns tightening like a fist. Village by village, they tried to choke the breath from our land. When they captured one of my generals, they sent word that I should surrender to save the people. I answered, "A lion does not surrender to save the grass. He fights to remind it why it must grow." That year, drought returned. The rivers shrank to veins of mud, and the cattle died in fields cracked like old skin. Men began to doubt not me, but the sky itself. I felt their weariness like stones in my chest. So I called for a great prayer. From every corner of the empire they came, soldiers, women, children, scholars. We gathered on the plain at dawn. The horizon burned with light. 10,000 voices rose together, the sound trembling through the air like wind through reeds. We prayed for rain, for mercy, for strength. And as the final Amin echoed, the clouds broke open. Rain fell, hard and sweet, washing dust from faces and despair from hearts. Men laughed and cried together, and I raised my hands not in command, but in gratitude. That moment reminded me why we endured. Because God still answered. The reprieve was brief. The French returned with more guns, more soldiers, more resolve. We fought them again and again, each battle fiercer than the last. In the noise of cannon and the scream of horses, I sometimes closed my eyes and heard only the river of my youth. Calm, patient, eternal. It reminded me that I was not fighting for this day, or even this life, but for something that would flow beyond both. When I finally lay down at night, the air thick with smoke and prayer, I thought of how fire and faith had become my twin companions. Fire destroys, faith rebuilds. Together, they had forged us into something that could not be conquered, only scattered. And though I did not yet know it, the path ahead would lead me not to victory, but to exile. And from exile, to immortality. There comes a time when even the bravest must walk backward to keep the fire alive, not as surrender, but as patience made flesh. When the French closed in from every side, north, west, east, I gathered what remained of my men and began the long retreat southward, toward the deep forests where the land itself could guard us. We were not running. We were enduring. The air was thick with dust and the smell of exhaustion. Behind us lay the villages that once sang our names. Before us, only silence and the long road. Our horses staggered, our boots fell apart, our rifles, carried for years, now felt heavier than fate. Yet we moved, because to stop was to die, and to die without purpose was the only defeat I would never accept. Each morning we prayed before we walked. 10 men would call the dawn Adan, their voices hoarse, trembling but certain. It echoed through the trees, startling the birds into flight. The forest answered our prayers with dew, tiny drops that clung to every leaf like forgiveness. Sometimes, when the sun rose, I would close my eyes and feel the warmth on my face. I imagined it was God himself, touching my brow, reminding me that he still saw us. Our path wound through jungles older than memory. The ground was slick with moss. The air smelled of rain, rot, and life intertwined. We crossed rivers waist deep, their waters cold as the truth. We built rafts from fallen trees, carrying our few weapons and sacred texts above the current. At night, we slept beneath canopies so dense that the stars were only rumors whispered by wind. Mosquitoes sang their cruel hymns, and fever took men as quietly as sleep. We buried them where they fell, facing east, marking their graves with stones and verses. I began to lose count, but I never lost the prayer. Food grew scarce. We boiled bark, roasted roots, ate what the forest offered without question. Still, the men shared whatever they had, 1 handful of rice divided among 4 mouths. No one complained. In hunger, we were equals. One night, a soldier placed his only ration of dried meat in my hand. He said, "Fama, you are the heart. The heart must not stop. I looked at him and wept. Not for myself, but for the kind of faith that turns hunger into strength. The French followed close behind, their reports carried by the wind. Columns marching, villages burning, promises of gold for my capture. Some of my allies surrendered, others betrayed me. But betrayal cannot wound a man whose loyalty lies with something eternal. Let them sell my name. They could not sell my purpose. We reached the forest of Bela, where the trees grew like pillars in a green mosque. There, I ordered the men to rest. We built small huts of palm leaves and mud, lit fires that spoke softly instead of roaring. In the evenings, I sat with my commanders, our maps spread upon the ground. The rivers had become our only roads now. We spoke in whispers, not because we feared the enemy, but because the forest had earned its silence. It was there, in Bela, that I began to write letters. One to my mother, though I knew she might never read it. In it, I said, "Mother, the path grows narrow, but my faith does not. If I do not return, tell the people that freedom is like the wind. You cannot see it, but you can feel it on your face when you raise your head. Tell them I am walking toward the sea, where perhaps even chains melt into salt." I sealed it with a prayer and placed it beneath a stone by the riverbank. As weeks turned to months, the forest became both ally and enemy. It hid us, fed us, sheltered us, but it also swallowed us. The men grew thinner, their faces shadowed, their laughter rare. Once, when fever swept through the camp, I spent the night moving from one hut to another, cooling foreheads with river water. I whispered the same verse to each man. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. Some lived, some did not. But even in death, their faces looked peaceful, as if the forest itself had promised to remember them. In those lonely nights, I spoke often with God, not as a general speaks to command, but as a child speaks to his father. I asked why he had chosen me for this burden. The answer came not in words, but in the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of rain, the slow, patient heartbeat of the world. It said, "Endure. That is victory." One evening, as dusk spread like spilled ink across the trees, a scout returned, breathless. "The French are near," he said. His voice shook, but not from fear, from fatigue. We had reached the edge of the forest. Beyond lay the plains of the coast. I knew what that meant: exile or death. I gathered the men for one last prayer under the fading light. We formed a circle, rifles laid beside us, hands open to the sky. I said, "My brothers, we have walked through fire and hunger, through betrayal and silence. If we are to die, let it be with dignity. If we are to live, let it be with gratitude. But whatever happens, know this: the French can conquer our bodies, not our belief. They can erase our names, not our example." The men whispered amin, their voices trembling like the last notes of a song. That night, as we slept, the sky broke open with thunder. The rain came down in torrents, and in its roar, I heard something: fate arriving. At dawn, we were surrounded. Hundreds of soldiers in blue uniforms, their rifles glinting in the first light. We fired until the barrels steamed, until smoke turned the air white. But they were too many. When they seized me, I did not struggle. My fight had never been against men. It had been against forgetting. And I had already won that war. They bound my hands once more, just as others had done long ago. But this time, the ropes felt light. for I carried within me something no chain could bind. As they led me away through the wet grass, I turned once more toward the forest and whispered, "Do not grieve, my brothers. The roots are still alive. They will grow again. Defeat does not come all at once. It arrives slowly, like dusk, soft at first, then absolute. By the time the sun of my empire began to fade, I had already learned to walk in the half-light of endurance." The French pressed from every side. Their forts rose along the rivers like thorns in the flesh of the land, their flags casting long shadows over the villages that had once sung our praises. Our supply lines faltered, our rifles aged, our men grew thin. But still we fought, not for victory, but for memory, for the dignity of saying, "We were here, and we did not bow." Each morning began the same way. The call to prayer echoed faintly across the camp, more whisper than song. We washed our faces in the dust because water had become a luxury. Then we moved, always moving, through forests that swallowed our footprints, through plains where vultures followed like prophets of hunger. Behind us, the world we had built was turning to smoke. I called it the long retreat, but in truth, it was not retreat. It was pilgrimage. We carried with us not treasure, but testimony. Men carried their rifles and their verses. Women carried their children and their silence. Every step southward was a prayer written in dust. Even the horses seemed to understand. Their breath came slow, patient, resigned. When they stumbled, we lifted them gently, as if ashamed to let another servant of God fall before we did. Some nights, the forest glowed with fireflies. They hovered like souls, flickering above the ground where so many had fallen. The men said they were the spirits of our dead warriors guiding us onward. I believed them. When I walked at the front of the column, their light brushed my hands like blessings. There were days of silence, too. Days when the only sound was the shuffle of weary feet and the rustle of leaves. The men no longer sang. Their throats were too dry for melody. But faith has its own music. When someone stumbled, another offered an arm. When someone whispered a verse, another whispered Amen. Even despair can be holy when shared. One evening, as the sky burned red, I stopped to watch the sun die behind the hills. My son Karamoko stood beside me. He was young, proud, carrying the fire of my youth. He said, "Father, should we not turn and fight again?" I looked at him, at the hope still unbroken in his eyes, and I said, "Yes, we will fight again, but not today." Even the prophet rested between battles. He bowed his head, and I saw in him both my beginning and my end. We reached the forest lands of Côte d'Ivoire, a world of green shadow and endless rain. There, the air was heavy and kind, the trees older than kingdoms. We built new camps beneath their canopies, where the sound of battle could not find us for a while. The people of those forests took us in, gave us cassava and refuge. Their faces were strangers, but their kindness familiar. It was the same mercy I had always prayed to deserve. For a time, the war seemed far away. At night, I heard the frogs singing by the rivers, the rhythm so steady it felt like a heartbeat. I would close my eyes and imagine that it was the empire breathing through the darkness. But peace built on exhaustion is fragile. It trembles even in sleep. Soon, French patrols appeared at the edges of the forest, like ghosts of the world we had fled. We fought again, brief, desperate clashes in the mist. Our powder was damp, our weapons rusting, our men sick with fever. Yet none deserted. They had followed me too long to abandon faith now. I watched them fight with the same quiet fury I had once seen in my father's eyes. The fury of those who know they are outnumbered but not outlived. Then came the day I knew the end was near. It was morning, soft and gold, the kind of morning that makes you forget war exists. We had stopped by a riverbank to rest. I watched the water ripple, remembering another river long ago, the Milo of my childhood, where my mother had once traced verses in the sand. For a moment, time folded. I could almost hear her voice. I whispered to her memory, "I have kept my promise, Mother. No man in my sight has lived chained." The river answered with silence, but the kind that comforts rather than condemns. Later that day, the French surrounded us. There was no grand battle, no trumpet, only rain and the quiet sound of men laying down weapons that had become part of their bones. I did not surrender out of fear. I surrendered because faith had already written another task for me: to live, to bear witness. When they took me, I carried no sword, only the Quran wrapped in cloth against my heart. They led me away from the land I had sworn to protect. The road to exile was long and slow, but I felt no bitterness. Defeat in this world, I told myself, is only a delay in the victory of the next. My people would remember, even if the world forgot. As we crossed the final border, I looked back once more, the forests, the hills, the rivers. They were silent, yet alive, as if listening. I said softly, "Tell the children of Wassoulou that their father has gone ahead to prepare a freer place." Then I turned my face toward the setting sun and walked on. The sea was the first thing that made me feel small again. I had known mountains, forests, rivers wide as dreams. But the ocean was another kind of God. When the French brought me to the coast, I stood upon the sand, chains at my wrists, and stared at that endless blue. It did not move like the rivers of my homeland. It breathed, it devoured, it sang in a tongue too vast for men to translate. They said we would cross it to a place called Gabon, a place I had never heard of, where the air would taste of salt instead of dust, and where they said even memory rusted. The ship was made of iron and arrogance. Its belly stank of oil and wet rope. When they led me aboard, the floor trembled beneath my feet, as though the earth itself were saying farewell. The chains clinked softly, familiar as old ghosts. I did not hate them. I pitied them. For every link was a reminder that men still believed they could cage what God had already claimed free. The voyage was long. The sea never sleeps. It groans, whispers, roars. At night, I would stand on the deck beneath a sky so full of stars that it looked like the pages of the Quran scattered open above me. The wind carried salt into my beard and memory into my eyes. I thought of the Milo River, of the smell of rain on red soil, of my mother's hands tracing verses in dust. Sometimes I closed my eyes and imagined I was a boy again, counting the ripples of water, not the days of captivity, but every morning, when the sun rose like a wound over the horizon, I remembered who I had become and why. The French officers treated me with a curious respect. Perhaps they thought kindness would erase dignity. They called me the Old Lion, a title meant to tame both praise and fear. I smiled at their words. Lions do not care what the hunters call them. One of them, a young officer with kind eyes, once asked me, "Do you regret it all? The fighting, the blood, the years?" I answered, "Regret is for those who chose comfort over conviction. I chose faith. It is lighter to carry," he nodded. But I knew he did not understand. Few ever do. When we reached the coast of Gabon, the air was heavy with moisture and the scent of mangrove trees. The land shimmered green and gold, as if the forest itself was trying to console me. They took me to a house near the sea. White walls, shuttered windows, soldiers at the gate. From my window, I could see the ocean stretch into forever. It was both prison and paradise. The waves came and went like prayers repeated without end. In their rhythm, I found peace. Days became weeks. Weeks turned to years. I aged like the tide, slowly, steadily, without complaint. The French sent doctors, guards, priests. I welcomed them all, listened, smiled. But my real companions were silence and scripture. Each morning before dawn, I spread my mat and prayed toward the unseen east, toward home. The call to prayer came only from memory now. But it was enough. Faith, once rooted, does not need sound to grow. In the afternoons, I would sit beneath a palm tree, watching the horizon blur between sky and sea. Sometimes I spoke to the wind, pretending it was an old friend. I told it stories of my people, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the courage of men, the tenderness of mothers. The wind never answered, but it carried my words away. And I like to think they reached someone, somewhere, across the water. At night, when the moon hung low and silver, I felt closest to home. The same moon that watched over Wassoulou now kept vigil over me. Its light touched the waves and turned them into fields of moving gold. I would whisper, La ilaha illallah, and feel the vastness within the words. The guards thought I prayed to escape. They were wrong. I prayed to stay present, peaceful, awake until the end. Once, during the rainy season, a storm struck the coast. Winds tore at the trees, waves rose high as houses. The guards ran shouting, the sky flashed white with anger. But I sat by the window and watched, unafraid. Because I knew that storms were only the world remembering its power, and I too had lived as a storm. When it passed, the air smelled clean again, and I thanked God for the reminder. In my later years, I began to write. Not with ink, but with memory. Every face I had known returned to me. The soldiers, the scholars, the mothers, the martyrs. I spoke their names aloud each evening, as though reciting a litany of love. Their lives became verses, their sacrifices, the scripture of our struggle. I wanted the French to hear me, to know that an empire may end, but a story never does. Sometimes I wondered what had become of my people. Had the seeds we planted survived? Had the children of Wassoulou grown strong beneath the weight of memory? In my heart, I believed they had. Because freedom, once awakened, does not sleep again. It only dreams until it is called. As age bent my back and dimmed my eyes, I began to feel the nearness of departure. Not with fear, but with curiosity. Death, I thought, must be like the sea, vast, unknowable, and waiting to carry us home. One night, I dreamed of my mother. She stood by the Milo River, her veil white, her hands outstretched. The water was calm, reflecting stars that looked like lanterns of mercy. She said, "You have done enough, my son. Come rest." When I woke, the room smelled faintly of rain and earth. I knew then that the journey was almost over. The morning of my last prayer. The ocean was still. The air hung heavy with silence. I faced the east and whispered the verses I had carried since childhood. The same ones she had traced for me in the dust so long ago. Each word felt like a step across invisible water. When I reached the end, I smiled. They say I died in exile. They are wrong. Exile is for those who forget where they belong. I never forgot. Even here, thousands of miles from the Milo, my heart was still walking beside its banks. My breath was still shaped by its rhythm. My soul still bowed toward its sunrise. I was already home. And when the last light left my eyes, I prayed that the world would remember. Not the battles, not the chains, not the empire, but the faith. Because faith is the only empire that never falls. When the ship took me from the coast, I did not look back. The sea stretched wide and endless, a sheet of moving glass beneath a sky too blue to trust. The chains on my wrists were light compared to those of memory. For the first time in years, I could no longer smell the dust of Africa. Only salt, only distance. The soldiers who guarded me were silent. They avoided my gaze as if my eyes still carried the weight of command. I pitied them. A man who obeys without understanding is as much a captive as the one he guards. As the ship cut through the waves, I stood on the deck and let the wind strike my face. It smelled of rain, of unknown lands, of endings. I thought of my people, the mothers grinding millet in villages now under foreign flags, the soldiers who had fallen with verses on their lips, the children who would grow up learning the conqueror's language before their own. I whispered each of their names to the sea. Perhaps the waves would carry them home. Days blurred into nights. The horizon never changed, only the color of the water, from green to gray to black. I recited the Quran softly, each verse a small fire against the emptiness. Sometimes, in the rhythm of the ship's creaking, I heard echoes of the drums of Wassoulou. Memory has its own heartbeat. It will not be silenced, even by oceans. When we reached Gabon, the air was heavy and wet, full of insects and grief. The French officers escorted me to a small compound on a hill overlooking the sea. They called it residence. I called it waiting. It had whitewashed walls, a single prayer mat, and a window facing the horizon, always the same horizon that led back to home. The days there moved like molasses. I woke before dawn to pray, listening to the slow breathing of the ocean. The surf whispered like an old friend telling stories I half remembered. I kept my Quran near, its pages soft and from years of touch. Each time I opened it, the scent of home rose. Smoke, sand, mango, river. I lived between those pages more than I lived between the walls. Occasionally, French officers came to visit. They spoke to me through interpreters, asking if I regretted the war. I told them, regret belongs to those who fight without purpose. I fought for freedom. Can a bird regret the sky? They never stayed long. Some saluted me quietly as they left, as if unsure whom they were meant to honor or fear. News from my homeland reached me rarely. Letters from my sons came through traders or sympathetic clerks. They told me that the French now ruled in Bisandugu, that the mosques still stood, but the prayers were whispered instead of sung. I wept, not for the loss of power, but for the silence. For faith, too, needs a voice. So I began to write again, though I had no ink and little paper. I wrote with charcoal on scraps of wood, on the back of letters, on the walls of my cell when I had to. I wrote to remind myself that words, like water, always find a way to flow. At night, I would sit by the window and watch the moon's reflection tremble on the sea. It reminded me of the river Milo, shimmering under the same moon so many miles away. Sometimes I closed my eyes and let the sound of the waves blend with memory, the laughter of my men, the rhythm of horses, the call to prayer rising through the mist. For a heartbeat, I was there again. Then the sea breathed, and I was old once more. As the years passed, my body grew weaker, but my mind sharpened like the edge of a polished blade. I spent long hours teaching the guards' children to read Arabic. Their laughter filled the compound, echoing between the walls like sunlight finding its way through clouds. One of them, a boy with bright eyes, asked me, "Will you ever go home, old man?" I smiled and said, "I never left. My home lives in every prayer I speak." He didn't understand then. Perhaps one day he would. Illness came quietly, like a polite visitor. It began with fatigue, then a fever that shimmered in my blood like gold dust. I knew it was the end. One evening, I asked for my prayer mat to be placed near the window. The ocean outside was calm, as if holding its breath. I performed ablution with the little water they brought me, feeling the coolness slide over my skin like mercy. Then I prayed, slowly, deeply, without hurry. Every movement was a memory. My mother's face, my father's silence, my soldiers' courage, my people's endurance. When I finished, I did not rise. I simply looked toward the horizon and whispered, "O Lord, you are the beginning and the end. If I have failed, forgive me. If I have served, accept me. Let my spirit return not to chains, but to you." The wind entered the room, carrying the scent of salt and rain. Some said it was a storm coming. I knew better. It was the river Milo, finding me at last, crossing land and sea to bring me home. I closed my eyes and saw my mother's hand reaching out, her blue scarf fluttering in the wind. I reached back. There was no pain, only release, like stepping once more into the cool water of my youth. And in that moment, I was both the river and the sea, both exile and home. They buried me far from the river of my birth. Yet I know that the earth beneath my grave remembers the same song of creation, the rhythm of rain, the heartbeat of drums, the whispers of wind through trees. Wherever the soil holds memory, there I live. They say my empire is gone. Let them. Empires are only shadows of belief. They vanish when the sun moves. But faith, the faith that once breathed through our prayers and our swords, that endures like the scent of fire on iron. It lingers in the soil, in the songs of children, in the eyes of those who still lift their heads and say, "I am free." After my death, the French wrote their histories. They called me rebel, fanatic, tyrant. They measured my worth by the battles they won and the treaties they broke. But history written in ink fades. The one written in spirit does not. I was not born to build a monument of stone. I was born to remind men that even chains can sing if faith gives them a voice. Now I watch from a place where time bends like the river's curve. I see the land I loved. Wassoulou, Guinea, Mali, Sierra Leone. Still alive beneath the same sun. I see my people walking freely in markets once patrolled by soldiers, praying in mosques once silenced by fear. I hear the call to prayer rise again, steady and proud, and I smile. For every verse that survived their empire is a victory they can never count. Sometimes I see a young boy sitting by a river, tracing words into the sand the way my mother once did for me. He writes, "La ilaha illallah," and the letters blur as the tide comes in. He laughs, thinking he has lost them. But I know the river carries them forward, carrying my story too. The boy does not know my name, yet my breath moves in his chest when he speaks of freedom. That is enough. I have learned that death is not the opposite of life. It is its translation into eternity. In this silence, I am still teaching, still praying, still walking beside those who refuse to kneel. Each time a man chooses justice over comfort, I rise again. Each time a mother whispers faith into her child's ear, I am reborn. And when the drums of Africa thunder at dusk, when the river glows gold beneath the dying sun, it is my heartbeat you hear between the notes. To those who remember me, I say, do not mourn. Do not build statues that crumble or songs that fade. Build faith, for that is the only fortress no empire can breach. Let your prayers be your banners, your kindness your law, your endurance your victory. Freedom is not a gift to be received. It is a duty to be lived again and again. If you stand by the Milo River someday, listen. You will hear the sound of water flowing over stones, steady and eternal. In that sound is every step I took, every vow I made, every breath I spent for the sake of dignity. The river does not weep for the fallen. It carries them forward. And I, Samory Touré, am still flowing, still moving, still free. The river flows on. Long after kings and conquerors have vanished, it still remembers their footsteps, their prayers, their dreams. And somewhere within that eternal flow, Samory Touré still walks. A man of faith, of fire, of freedom. If his voice has reached you tonight, carry it with you. Remember that freedom, once awakened, never sleeps again. Thank you for journeying with me. Before you drift away, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what story of courage would you like to hear next? Until then, may peace rest upon your heart, and may your dreams be gentle as the river's song.